Okay, we're live on YouTube. And I guess I should say welcome again to episode 67. And I titled this Stopping Blood Sugar Spikes. And as I was sort of preparing for tonight, I realized that we really need to go a little bit more in depth than that. However, we will cover blood sugar spikes as well. But we'll also talk about natural agents to help control blood sugar. We'll talk about diet and blood sugar. Again, we'll talk a little bit about glucose, blood sugar, what it does to the body, how controlling insulin is also a primary factor in achieving optimal health, and a whole host of other things. So welcome, everybody. I see we have some more people coming in. We had last week a really powerful episode. We were talking about mental imagery, and we had some incredible audience participation. I see Trisha's here tonight, and we certainly want to thank her for her participation last week, which was really amazing. So thank you, Trisha, and I'm glad to see you back tonight. Okay, so let's get started. And as I said, I'm sort of titling tonight's talk "Controlling Blood Sugar" more than anything else. And we'll talk about what that basically means. We'll talk about glycation, which is where sugar binds to protein. We'll talk a little bit about endothelial dysfunction. That means that the cells lining the arteries, those have to be really healthy. And we'll talk about how glucose affects that. We'll spend a little bit of time talking about how to achieve better absorption of glucose, as well as increasing insulin sensitivity. So how your body basically is handling absorbing blood sugar, as well as insulin sensitivity, which is how sensitive your cells are to insulin doing what it's supposed to do. Because as many of us know, when people start to have insulin sensitivity issues, then they need more and more insulin to be able to get the glucose in. And the high levels of insulin have a whole host of problems that we'll talk about. And, a lot of times when you talk about blood sugar, it makes you think that basically all carbs and all sugar are bad. And I don't want you to come out of this episode thinking that. So we'll talk about some carbohydrates that actually are pretty good, to helping with blood glucose as well as insulin. We'll talk about a little bit about how to make our cells more efficient at utilizing glucose. And then we'll talk about natural agents. Now, there are a lot of natural agents. And if you type in, natural agents that control blood sugar, you're going to see a whole host of all kinds of things. So we'll briefly go through some of the more popular ones. And tonight's class actually got started because there was a Twitter storm by someone who was criticizing the people who are not diabetic, who are using continuous glucose monitors. Many of you have seen those. People wear that on the back of their arm, and basically it's going to tell you, you can connect that to your cell phone and you can actually monitor your blood sugar. And there was a doctor who was criticizing people who were doing this and they didn't have diabetes. And there was a whole kind of Twitter war. Twitter is very, very toxic place, generally speaking. But this particular thing came to my attention. And, as you know, my goal for all of these is for you to become your own authority in health. And quite frankly, having what's called postprandial blood sugar spikes, postprandial meaning after you eat, when you have that and they go too high, there is damage that's happening. And so quite frankly, I think, if you're in control of, there's many, many things you can do to control your blood sugar without having to do a continuous glucose monitor. That being said, there are people out there who are very educated themselves and are perfectly capable of deriving various types of things from wearing a continuous glucose monitor. So I'm certainly think it's fine for people to do that. And there's several companies that have actually come out with all kinds of artificial intelligence where you basically are able to track your food, and then it correlates with a continuous glucose monitor. And what we've learned actually in the last 5 years is that things like glycemic index, many of us have heard that. It's sort of, the ability, it's, certain foods have an impact on your blood sugar more than others. What we've learned in the last 5 or 10 years, based on research that was done out of the Weizmann Institute in Israel, is that your gut microbiome has a very critical role in actually determining your blood sugar response. So while the glycemic index of white potato can be very, very high, meaning it can make your blood sugar go up very, very high, it doesn't necessarily mean that you can look at a glycemic index and say, oh, okay, well, that is no good. I definitely can't eat that. It's not an exact measurement. And in fact, what the studies showed, there was a computational biologist by the name of Siegel, his last name was, who basically was able to, using what's basically artificial intelligence, was able to sequence, take a look at what type of bacteria you had in your gut, and can correlate that with predicted blood sugar responses. Meaning, for some people, ice cream, if they had a certain type of microbiome, ice cream didn't cause their blood sugar to actually go up at all. Whereas someone who had, say, a low glycemic carbohydrate, say barley as an example, generally speaking, we can look at the glycemic index and we could say, well, okay, it shouldn't make our blood sugar rise, but everyone is individual. So basically what I'm trying to say is that the glycemic index is not going to be a perfect measure. And therefore, for people who are trying to really, especially if they have a history of diabetes in the family, or they are creeping up towards prediabetes, or they have prediabetes, these sort of interventions, while doctors aren't prescribing them, doesn't necessarily mean that you on your own can't do some of this investigation on your own. And therefore, I don't see any problem with people doing it. Getting a prescription for a continuous glucose monitor. That being said, as I said, there are a whole host of things that most people can do before they get to that point. Okay, so let's jump into, that was a little detour, but what are we talking about when we think about blood glucose? Well, there are certain ways of measuring blood glucose. There's fasting blood sugar. There's postprandial blood sugar. Remember, we spoke about that, postprandial meaning after eating. And then there's measures of glycation. So let's go through each of those, and then we'll proceed to the rest of what we wanted to cover. So fasting blood sugar, many of you have gotten that from your primary care doctor. And generally, they want it to be under 100. But unfortunately, there have actually been some research studies to show that anything above 85 as a fasting blood sugar actually is starting to show some damage to your body. So in fact, this above 85 has even been shown to have a slightly increased risk for heart attack, just a fasting blood sugar above 85. So what is considered the general guidelines of modern medicine, unfortunately, might not be good enough. And we've spoken about that in terms of hemoglobin A1c in the past, as well as this notion of prediabetes. Prediabetes is a condition. It is a disease state that there is damage that is happening. It's not like you're pre-diabetic, safe, and then you fall off a cliff and then you're diabetic and you get all kinds of side effects. The side effects continue to get worse. These are arbitrary types of definitions that are used for diagnosis codes and the sort. But when you look at all the data, there is no question that when you're in a pre-diabetic state, as it is defined by modern medicine, that you are actually suffering from a certain amount of damage. So that's fasting blood sugar. Now, postprandial blood sugar, generally thinking about danger, believe it or not, even having a postprandial blood sugar over 140, which happens very, very frequently, still is linked to having some kinds of damage. And so it is important to have a general idea of how your body is processes blood sugar. There's a glucose tolerance test where they give you a challenge of glucose and they check to see how well your body is capable of bringing your blood sugar down after a couple hours. Now, that's another place where something like a continuous glucose monitor could play a role for people. But again, there are other ways we can measure that. So again, we spoke about fasting blood sugar, but there's also hemoglobin A1c. Now, many of you have heard of hemoglobin A1c, and I've certainly mentioned it on many other episodes. And this is basically a measure of blood sugar binding to hemoglobin. And the interesting thing is, and the unfortunate thing is that when the blood sugar binds to the hemoglobin, it doesn't let go. And the same thing happens to when it binds proteins around the body. So things like diabetic damage to the kidneys and retinopathy, all these are the result of what's called glycation, this binding of sugar and protein. Some doctors get a test called fructosamine, which sounds like fructose. It's basically another way of measuring the overall level of glycation in your body. Now, when you have this glycation going on, this is what's aging you. It's what makes your tendons stiff. It's what makes your skin start to wrinkle. All this is a form of glycation. And unfortunately, whenever I talk about blood glucose in all of these ways, it often comes off like terrifying, but unfortunately, but I don't want it to appear that way, that it's just this terrifying thing. The point is that we should be conscious of blood sugar because it is critical to our overall aging, as well as to so many other disease processes. And we'll spend a little time talking about that, because honestly, we need glucose. That's the primary energy of our cells. The Life Extension Foundation likens. They have a good analogy. It's like they say that blood glucose is like gasoline, and the reason it's like gasoline is because it burns and it releases certain things which are a potential problem. But more importantly, if there is too much gasoline, the gasoline is sort of running around with nowhere to go. And that in and of itself, unfortunately, is going to create an environment that is inflammatory and oxidative. So it's this excessive gasoline that's running around in your body. If it's not being brought into the muscles, brought into the cells, and it's circulating, it creates this inflammatory state. And when it spikes, that's basically what is happening. Unfortunately, when glucose is sort of circling around the body in the bloodstream and it doesn't have anywhere to go, it gets converted into triglycerides. And triglycerides can get stored as fat. It can also get put into the arteries of our heart. So we end up getting, it contributes to this atherosclerotic plaque that occurs in our coronary arteries. So anytime you have this blood sugar that's elevated, you have to realize that it often comes with this increased triglycerides, increased fat deposition, because it doesn't have anywhere to go. Now, all of this is going to contribute to, obviously, arterial blockage, as well as retinal damage, which we spoke about before, and also endothelial dysfunction. Now, this endothelial dysfunction, which we'll get to probably a little bit later, but we have to understand that when the blood sugar is running around through the cells, through the bloodstream when it's not needed, it is actually going to interfere with the endothelial cell's ability to dilate. And we'll talk about that a little bit later. Now, in addition to all this, unfortunately, when blood sugar is continuing to spike, you're also getting this elevation of insulin. Now, many of us think of insulin, we think of it as, the medicine that diabetics need to take to bring their blood sugar down. And it's true that insulin in the body is responsible for sort of directing the blood sugar to get into the cells. But one important fact about insulin is that it's also a growth factor. And that's why this sort of chronically elevated blood sugar, chronically elevated insulin is a promoter of cancer, because it's going to act as in a sense, like a growth hormone. It's going to precipitate more rapid cell division than is necessary. And in the context of these of people in general who have high blood sugar, they often often have also elevated blood sugar in the blood. Obviously, blood sugar in the blood is, and then also fat in the blood as well. And this is, I mean, essentially like a metabolic fuel for tumors. So this elevated insulin that occurs along with all these other things is putting the body in a position that favors sort of a state of cancer. In addition to all of this, to make matters worse, and again, I don't want to try to, anytime I talk about blood sugar, people always are like, you're scaring the crap out of me. But the truth is that on top of all this, when you have high levels of insulin and high levels of blood sugar, in our DNA, there are these regulatory genes that they're like, tumor suppressor genes. In other words, genes that are supposed to regulate things properly. And unfortunately, when insulin and glucose start to elevate, these regulatory genes can actually basically turn off. On top of all of this, unfortunately, insulin itself is oxidative. It's going to lead to oxidation, and oxidation is basically going to lead to damage and inflammation. So on top of all of these things, we have this whole host of things that are like domino effect, sort of going in all these different directions in terms of insulin and cells dividing and excess glucose turning into triglycerides and into fat and going into arterial walls, and glycation binding to proteins that are causing your skin to wrinkle and damaging your retina, all these things that are happening. And probably the most important thing that I can say about all of this is that there is the biggest unfortunate thing is that doctors don't communicate, unfortunately, to their patients enough that when they have pre-diabetes, all of these types of things are happening. And they're happening maybe not to the same extent as someone who frankly has diabetes, but they are still happening. Because I can't tell you how many times people come in and say, oh, well, I have pre-diabetes, as if, they just haven't gotten diabetes yet. We have to understand, and you should now fully understand the reasons why, that when someone has pre-diabetes, they're suffering from all of these sorts of things. So let's talk a little bit more about this endothelial cell. So we have the artery, and we spoke about this in another class, but the artery is lined with just really one layer of cells. And this one layer of cells is probably the most important part of the health of your vasculature. It releases all kinds of things. For example, it releases what's called nitric oxide, which is responsible for dilating your arteries. And unfortunately, when you have elevated blood sugar, the glucose, which we've spoken about, is oxidizing, as well as the insulin, is going to interfere with nitric oxide, which is basically going to prevent the blood vessels from dilating. And when that happens, unfortunately, there can be a restriction of the blood to say the heart. And this is why the most common time for cardiovascular death is basically in 2 hours, a period of 2 hours after eating. And that's because if the blood sugar is spiking super duper high, it's going to interfere again with this nitric oxide. And if the heart needs that blood and is unable to open up because honestly, it's not capable of doing that because of the high blood sugar, then that's the reason why a lot of deaths happen within 2 hours after eating, a very high glycemic, blood sugar spike meal. On top of all that, you get these adhesion molecules that occur in the endothelial, on the endothelial cells, which basically make the artery like sticky. So it's going to sort of stick onto things. And so that's why, when they do these, 2-hour glucose tolerance tests, this is a very good predictor of heart attacks, because it tells us how effective is our body to lowering a challenge of blood sugar. Now, we've spoken up until this point with the fact that, well, certain foods are going to do that, but your body also has the ability to handle these things some people more effectively than others. That's why, again, this sort of challenge of blood sugar glucose tolerance test gives you a general indicator of how good your body is at taking the challenge and making sure it doesn't spike up too much. Because when we have sort of, pre-diabetes, and we've gotten into these metabolic states of diabetes, your body is, because of insulin resistance, it's not capable of sort of bringing these things down. So all of these things hopefully give you a general understanding of why it's so important to have just a general understanding of both blood sugar as well as insulin. Okay. So ultimately, I think now you understand why this is such a powerful strategy, thinking about it from like just one perspective, thinking about it from the insulin glucose perspective, because of, again, this sort of domino effect. Because ultimately, when you start to control both blood sugar and insulin, and I have been ordering, probably for the last year now, I've been ordering fasting insulin levels on a lot of my patients, because it is a very good indicator of what's going on in this particular context. But we know that any intervention that is going to lower insulin and lower blood sugar is, remember, also going to lower triglycerides, because again, that excess glucose is often getting converted to triglycerides, and it also tends to lower LDL, that's the bad cholesterol, as well as inflammatory markers, like we spoke of one many times, called C-reactive protein. All of these sort of go down when you start to control for blood sugar and insulin. So much so that, it's sort of like the 80-20 rule. I've spoken about that before, where 20% of things make 80% of the effect. In other words, you don't have to be this crazy person who is trying to, control every single thing. We've spoken about in a class many weeks ago about sort of the top 7 blood tests that I recommend, one of them being insulin and hemoglobin A1c, and fasting blood sugar. And all of these provide, just focusing on those is going to prevent those domino effects that are going to happen. Now, we've only spoken about these blood tests. Again, we spoke about the C-reactive protein, which is like this inflammatory, LDL, triglycerides, insulin, all these things. When we have those lower, we're also going to reduce the incidence of vascular disease. We spoke about insulin and cancer. So your overall risk for cancer is going to drop, as well as dementia, because quite frankly, dementia has, some people have called it sort of a type 3 diabetes, because there's certain things happening in the brain that are very much similar to diabetes. So how are we capable? How can we achieve these healthy levels? How do we enhance insulin sensitivity? How do we maybe reduce blood sugar absorption? There's many ways. So the rest of tonight's talk, we'll talk about various lifestyle, dietary, and supplement strategies to be able to start to get a handle on some of these things. So the first thing that I would like to mention is that there have been a lot of studies that have been done on just reducing calories. And there are a whole host of people who actually are on lower calorie, high nutrient dense diets. Sorry, I'm just going to I'm moving it around just so I can see comments as they come in. So, so there are people that do essentially lower calorie counts. Now, there are many versions of low calorie diets. The most important thing about going on a relatively low calorie diet is that it has to be very nutrient dense, or else it's going to cause a whole bunch of damage to your body metabolically. But there are people who are capable of eating a much lower calorie diet. There's one diet called the Nutritarian Diet by Dr. Joel Fuhrman, which overall tends to be a lower calorie diet with a lot of nutrient density. And there are people who are on what's called calorie restriction, which, again, it's not something I can recommend, but the studies show that just generally reducing calorie intake is actually going to increase insulin sensitivity, as well as have a more healthy type of glucose absorption. Obviously, selection of foods is going to be incredibly important. And usually when I explain this, since we've been talking about carbs and sugar and all this sort of thing, we tend to think that, well, maybe carbs are the problem. But generally, there are, just evolutionarily speaking, many cultures that evolved, to be eating carbs. The Mediterranean diet has carbs, and there's a lot lower incidence of diabetes there, and a whole host of cultures around the world. So, as an example, barley. Barley is one of the carbohydrates that can be very helpful for people who, in other words, if you're choosing carbohydrates, I always tell people to pick intact grains instead of processed grains. So in other words, anytime anything is ground into a flour, it has the capability much more of being able to spike your blood sugar. So crackers that have been milled into a flour and then compressed, it can be an issue. Obviously, most breads, there are breads that are made from intact grains, like Ezekiel bread, sprouted grains. But the interesting thing about barley is that it also increases the excretion of bile. Now, bile is used to emulsify and digest fat, and it's composed of cholesterol. So anytime you have something that increases the excretion of bile acids, it usually also lowers cholesterol. So you get this cholesterol lowering effect with barley, and because it has soluble and insoluble fiber, it's able to bind the bile acids and sort of let them pass through. And it also has been shown to reduce fasting insulin as well. So intact grains, obviously, grains for some people can be an issue, and I'm always in favor of, if people are having issues, that various types of elimination diets where you actually try to eliminate all grains and see what happens is also something that can be done. Beans have generally been shown to better hemoglobin A1c, as well as fructosamine, which is that other measure of glycation. Remember that glycation being the binding of sugar to protein, which causes your cells, your skin to wrinkle, your eyes to have issues, your kidneys, your tendons to feel, stiff as you get older, all these sort of aging types of things. So in addition to reducing glycation, which in a sense is like reducing one of the critical elements of aging, it also helps with the hemoglobin A1c as well. And when you have, just speaking of glycation, now when you have glycation happening, your body does the best that it can to try to prevent this. And it uses a vitamin called thiamine, which is B1, I think. But there's actually a fat-soluble type of B1 called benfotiamine, which for people who have diabetes, who are dealing with a lot of glycation, can be very, very helpful for people as well. Because the body, again, is consuming this thiamine when it's trying to prevent this glycation. And some people have referred to diabetes as a relative thiamine deficiency because all this glycation is happening. And as a result, this thiamine is is really starting to get used up. Beans have also been shown to reduce DNA damage as well. They're best cooked by pressure cooking them, because that removes some of the what are called lectins, which in some people can affect the gut and make them less tolerant of beans. And honestly, some people just can't eat beans. We spoke about the FODMAP diet and people, and how effective that was for people who have, irritable bowel syndrome. And it's quite clear that not everyone can handle grains, not everyone can handle beans. But if you can, they can really make a very good addition to your diet when we're speaking about carbohydrates and blood sugar. Because, we weren't meant to be on a keto diet. Again, cultures around the world thrived with long-lasting lives by eating foods that had carbohydrates. So obviously, it can be done. And your choice of carbohydrates is critical. And so beans, generally speaking, when I'm looking at, I do a lot of food journal reviews on my patients. And generally, if, again, very, very generally speaking, you have greens, which are a type of carbohydrate. You can get carbs from them. And you have beans, and generally it doesn't bother me if the total carb count starts to get high as a result of greens and beans, because both of these are nutrient dense for different reasons. Beans also have protein and an enormous amount of fiber, as insoluble and soluble, as well as some resistant starch in some beans as well. So there are a whole host of reasons why you can be careful and choose appropriate carbohydrates that are going to benefit you as well. Now, thinking about blood sugar, obviously we want it to go where it needs to go. In other words, your muscles your muscles are going to they can store a little bit of blood sugar. Actually, it's able to do that through glycogen. So therefore, if we increase the need of our muscles for blood sugar, then our blood sugar is going to be better. And what's the best way of doing that? Well, of course, it's exercise. Anytime you exercise, you are using the glycogen in your muscles. And when you use the glycogen in your muscles, then it needs to be restored. And it does that by bringing in a healthy manner the blood sugar that's circulating around your body. That's probably why, people who are, farmers, and you go back history, never had probably any of these issues because they were, they were active, and they needed the energy. We've spoken in a past class about how walking and you can look at cities and you can pretty much predict the amount of metabolic problems like diabetes if you look at the average number of steps that are done in that particular city. And cities that don't that have very low amounts of walking have higher amounts of metabolic disease. So much so that somewhere around like the 3,000 to 5,000 range, there was a man who wrote a book called In Praise of Walking, who looked at all the studies, and he said, if you look at the studies, it's after 3,000 to 5,000. If it's below 3,000 to 5,000, the amount of metabolic disease just skyrockets. But if people are walking, over 5,000, it dramatically drops. You look at certain places, for example, Tokyo, they're eating a lot of white rice. That's the main starch in their diet. But they also walk an average of 7,000 steps a day, which is a lot more than most people are doing. And so I find that fascinating, and it's something that we should keep in mind, that our bodies were actually meant to be active, and you got to keep on moving. I mean, you just got to keep on moving, not just because your body was meant to move, but looking at it from a very narrow perspective, like we're doing it tonight, looking at the body through the lens of glucose and insulin. it's obvious that we need to get that blood sugar where it's supposed to go. They've done studies to show that when you eat lunch, after you eat lunch, if you stand at a desk, your postprandial blood sugar, remember the blood sugar after you eat, actually is much less just from a standing desk. So this is one thing that you can do is maybe work after your lunch at a standing desk, but also postprandial walking. So we know postprandial means after a meal. So taking a walk after you have a meal, like a very light stroll, is going to have a dramatic effect at lowering that blood sugar spike. Working out in a fasted state in the morning is also going to deplete the glycogen in your muscles, such that when you have when you eat carbohydrates after, they're going to go into the blood, and the muscles are just going to take them right in. And building muscle. If you build muscle, and one of the challenges of aging that I repeat to you over and over again is you have to be relentless about preserving your muscle mass as you get older. Because if you don't do anything, you may not look like your muscles are any smaller for a very, very long time. But even after like the age of, once you get into your 30s, even, you start to see what's happening is your muscle starts to get marbled, like, fatty meat. And it may not look smaller, but instead of being nice and lean and muscular, which is going to store glycogen and be able to use blood sugar, it's going to slowly basically become fatty, and you're going to have less muscle mass. And when you have less muscle mass, unfortunately, what happens is that your metabolism actually slows down, such that the same number of calories that you've been eating your whole life, because you have less muscle, is going to cause weight gain, because your metabolic rate is dropping. Your metabolic need, the number of calories you need, is dropping. And the same number of calories you've been eating your whole life is now going to cause you to gain weight. That's basically what's happening. So aging should be a relentless pursuit of maintaining muscle mass through resistance training and making sure that, again, in this case, looking at it from the very narrow lens of blood sugar, to make sure that, you have this in mind. Okay. Okay, so let's talk a little bit about some natural agents that have been studied to be able to lower blood sugar. Now, what I would say is, I don't think that I'm not necessarily making any recommendations here. I think that if you have blood sugar issues, the first thing to know is, obviously, you have to work on your activity and your diet, and have a basic understanding of your body composition. After that's done, or even while it's going on, there are various types of natural agents that have been shown to be helpful for blood sugar. Sorry, just looking. I see we have a bunch of people who've come in a little bit later. Welcome, everyone. All right, so let's go through some of them. So one of them is green coffee bean extract. So this basically affects an enzyme that enables the body to create surplus glucose. This has been wrapped. There's so many supplements out there that have been shown to be helpful. This is one of them. Another is a Mckee berry extract, and this one has a very interesting effect. Mckee is M-A-Q-U-I. It basically has an effect on slowing the absorption of a meal, and has a really dramatic effect on insulin. So for people who have a higher insulin level, and that's something that they're following, taking Mckee berry extract can be very, very helpful. A lot of times, although the studies are never really definitive, because the money required to do all these studies is just not there for natural agents. But a lot of these studies that tend to help with blood sugar also generally usually have some effect. Not all, I can't promise it, but most of them have some effect on weight loss as well. Mulberry leaf extract has also been studied extensively, and this works in many different ways. It affects a glucose transporter, so it helps bring the glucose out of the bloodstream into the cell more efficiently. It also reduces blood sugar in the liver. Your body is capable of making sugar in the liver, and it also breaks down starch, which is another thing. So mulberry leaf extract has been shown, and all these are sort of supplements that you have to spend a little bit of time trying to figure out which ones might be good for you. Like, for example, with insulin levels, if you know you have a high insulin level, of all of these, probably Mckee berry is probably the best. Clove extract can also affect an enzyme that releases blood glucose into the bloodstream. There's so many places where you can affect blood glucose. You can affect the absorption. You can affect the breakdown of sugars in the gut. You can bind them. You can affect them through the liver. You can affect them through how they're being pulled into the cell. Whole host of things. Next one's probably my favorite, which is glucomannan. Glucomannan, which is what miracle noodles are made of. Now, this has been studied extensively for blood sugar, and you only need around 2 grams per day of that, and you get that with just one serving of miracle noodles. And this, amazingly, remember we were talking about postprandial glucose, just 2 grams, just one serving of miracle noodles, half a bag, will give you the 2 grams, and it's actually been shown to reduce postprandial blood sugar by 84%. Incredible. And has also been associated with a pound per week of weight loss as well. So of course, that's my favorite. There's so many things about miracle noodles being made of glucomannan, this konjac root, that are so incredible. And this has been studied, it's been studied extensively. I mean, if you go to PubMed and type in glucomannan, you'll see a host of studies, both for blood sugar, for cholesterol, for weight loss, whole host of things. And almost all the studies use just 2 grams. I mean, 2 grams is nothing. And the fact that it can do this is really incredibly powerful. And then there are what are called amylase inhibitors. Now, amylase is the enzyme that breaks down the chains of carbohydrate so you can think of this as like links on a chain, and each link is a glucose molecule, and an amylase comes in and it takes off one link of the chain, and that one link is a glucose particle or molecule. So if you inhibit that, then it doesn't break down into sugar. So green tea extract, and in fact, green tea just on its own has been associated with weight loss and better blood sugar, but you can buy green tea extract. However, I recommend that you just drink good quality green tea because it's delicious, and has a little bit of caffeine that may be helpful for your mood, as well as something called L-theanine, which definitely improves your mood. There is some bean extracts, sorghum extract. All of these have an effect on amylase. Then we have sucrase inhibitors. So sucrase breaks down sucrose. Sucrose is table sugar, and table sugar is basically made up of a fructose molecule and a glucose molecule. So when you have sucrase, you basically are thinking of it again like a chain. You have one fructose and one glucose, and then sucrase comes in the middle and then breaks them apart. And then you have a free-floating glucose and a free-floating fructose. I did a whole entire episode on sort of understanding sugar and differences between glucose and fructose. So I recommend for anyone who's interested in a more detailed look at that to go back and look at that particular episode. There is a brown seaweed extract combined with another naturally occurring thing called L-arabinose that can inhibit this. And finally, something that I recommend and I've spoken about before is these things called Ampk activators. We've spoken about them many times, and one of them is the Gynostemma tea. So I recommend that highly, and I've been drinking that for many, many years. Berberine, which is very well known. Chromium, of course, has also been shown in some studies to help diabetics. The question really is, with all these sorts of things, is how effective are they for someone who already has healthy blood sugar? And that's a question that really hasn't been answered. Nonetheless, there are certain benefits in terms of aging that activating AMPK just generally makes sense from a general perspective. Things like metformin that people take for blood sugar have an effect here, and that might be the reason why people think that something like metformin lengthens life. Nonetheless, I'm a big fan of Gynostemma tea. It tastes good. It's naturally sweet, and is going to have an impact. And it's been used in traditional Chinese medicine for years and years and years. It's been known to help blood sugar. And then, of course, cinnamon. Gosh, I can't believe I almost forgot to mention cinnamon. Cinnamon can have, just with a couple grams per day, can be very, very powerful in lowering your overall fasting blood sugar. And the cinnamon that you should look for is the Ceylon cinnamon, Ceylon. The other cinnamon doesn't have doesn't have the same effect. So you want to buy Ceylon cinnamon and make a tea. I remember seeing. I'm a big fan of, when they have these people who like live to 120 or whatever, and they interview them. I love listening to those. Of course, sometimes, you find out that they've been smoking and drinking a pint of whiskey a night. But other times you hear other things. One of them was a guy in Mississippi who was like 105 and doing incredibly well. And, he drank like 3 or 4 cups of cinnamon tea per day. Again, I happen to just like anecdotally some of these types of stories. Anyway, cinnamon has been shown, Ceylon cinnamon has been shown to be beneficial. And I try to, at least over the last month or so, I've been trying to incorporate more cinnamon into my smoothie. And, it is actually quite nice to make a tea out of, just by itself, maybe with a little stevia to make it a little bit sweeter. And it actually tastes good as a cinnamon tea. And you can thank that 105-year-old guy from Mississippi for that particular one. And finally, magnesium. Literally almost everyone is deficient in magnesium, unfortunately. The reason for this are complicated, one being the fact that our soils are just depleted, and the fact that our vegetables don't have the same mineral content. It's a problem. So there are very few supplements that I recommend for everyone, because I think supplements you need to be careful with, and you should have a reason for that. I can't tell you how many times, I'll see a patient and I'll ask them, if they're on any supplements, and they'll rattle off all these supplements. And then I ask them, what's the reason for this? And most of the time, they just can't answer that question. And if you're on a supplement, the answer shouldn't be, it's supposed to be good for me. You should understand the reason why you, as an individual, being unique and one of a kind, are taking that particular supplement. But there are certain supplements like magnesium that I do think that everyone probably should take. And the studies that I saw, it was just 250 milligrams. Most people need more than that. And I often check magnesium, red blood cell magnesium, special blood test to see what the intracellular magnesium is to see what's going on. But it's been shown to help hemoglobin A1c, fasting. It also helps fasting insulin. So if anyone has a higher insulin level, we've spoken about the Mckee extract, but I would start with positively start with taking a magnesium supplement, because it's going to affect all of these things. And as I said, whenever you take something that has a decent effect on blood sugar and insulin, we're preventing all those dominoes from going into the triglycerides and the endothelial cells, affecting the endothelial cells. And I might just mention that I mentioned how the endothelial cells are really important for being able to open the blood vessels so that the heart can get the blood that it needs. But you should also know, especially the men out there, that these blood vessels in your genitals also need to be able to open up. And that's another reason why people with diabetes men have a lot of problems in terms of impotence. Part of this is because there's more rapid vascular damage, but also the inability of this nitric oxide to be able to open the blood vessels and let the blood get where it's supposed to go. So I always like to mention that. All right, so that covers everything that I wanted to talk about tonight. I almost see each one of these classes as looking at the body through a specific lens. And we've spoken about it in so many different ways. If you go back in my classes, it's like, okay, if we look at it through one particular way, in this case, we looked at it through blood sugar. One class we did it on a hormone called adiponectin, and we saw how everything is connected, but focused in on one particular thing and looked at the body as, through looking at it through that perspective. So next week, we have some couple weeks that I think will be interesting. Next week, we'll be talking about the emotional connection to food and how food interacts with our, we all have complicated relationships with food. And there have been a lot of sort of professional studies and people who specialize in this. I don't specialize in this, but I think I have an interesting perspective that may not follow the academic studies that talk about this, but I think I have some insights that I would like to share with you. We'll certainly cover some of what conventional doctors, weight loss doctors have to say about that, and go a little bit more in depth. And then the week after that, we have a guest, and we are going to talk about how he's basically a gardener, and he's written an amazing book on how to grow salad greens all year long with just a couple minutes a day in your house. They can be harvested in 7 to 10 days. And just with a little work each day, you can have a full salad bowl of greens. And I think you'll like his story. And I think you'll learn a lot about how important it is for us to have a little bit more control over the food we grow, and how the enjoyment of certain foods is actually connected in a lot of ways to how close we are to the food. In other words, these are called soil sprouts, a little different than micro. We've spoken about this before, but I want to go in depth. They're called soil sprouts, and they're a little bit different than microgreens. We'll talk a little bit about the difference between microgreens. And it's the easiest way to get vegetables into your diet in a healthy way that is enjoyable. It's delicious. It's remarkably easy, and I think it's critical for people who are making big changes in their health. One of those things that they need to do is to incorporate more greens in. And I can tell you, just if you do it on your own, and you see that you're capable of interacting with your food in such an intimate way, you start to enjoy the food so much more. And there is nothing that's packed with more nutrition than a salad that you literally just harvested and made. So I'm excited about that. That'll be in 2 weeks. But next week, again, we'll talk about the emotional aspects of food. And again, thank you so much for your attention. Had a great time talking about this. One question was to give a list of teas and other compounds. Shanti, you can reach out to me and I'll send you, there's several review articles I can send you and that sort of thing. So again, thank you so much for your attention. I'm always appreciative that everyone stays through the entire class. I'm always amazed at that. And I wish you all well, and I will see you next week. Good night, everyone.